There are places on Earth that seem perfectly ordinary by day, yet become something else entirely when darkness falls. For years, residents of a small, unremarkable town whispered about a stretch of highway that never seemed to follow the rules of logic, time, or space. To the casual traveler, it appeared like any other two-lane road cutting through farmland and forest. But those who lived nearby knew the truth. At night, the highway would vanish. No streetlights, no painted lines, not even the faintest trace of asphalt remained once the sun dipped below the horizon. Locals claimed that even the cars caught on it would disappear, swallowed into the earth as though the pavement had never existed. By sunrise, the road was back again, looking freshly paved, clean, and unsettlingly normal. Authorities brushed it off as rural superstition, but evidence piled up. Missing person reports stacked in police files, each one describing the last known location as Highway 88 near mile marker 47. Dashcam footage turned to static at the exact moment vehicles crossed that stretch. GPS systems failed, compasses spun wildly, and yet no agency dared to shut the road down. To outsiders, it sounded like a conspiracy theory, the kind of ghost story rural communities spun to pass the time. But to those who drove it daily, it was a deadly reality. Delivery drivers rerouted miles around it. Families refused to use it after dusk. The townsfolk told anyone who asked, the highway wasn't just dangerous, it was hungry. The rumors spread beyond the county lines. Online forums lit up with threads debating the truth. Paranormal enthusiasts called it a liminal hotspot. Skeptics labeled it mass hysteria, fueled by confirmation bias and rural myths. But there was one thing no one could explain away: the numbers. Dozens of cases over decades, consistent reports of vanishings after nightfall, and the peculiar fact that every map, whether state-issued, GPS-driven, or satellite-captured, showed Highway 88 clearly, a road that, according to locals, did not exist after dark. The first official investigation happened quietly, without press releases or warnings. A highway patrol unit staked out the site one October evening, waiting to observe the phenomenon. They parked near mile marker 47, headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt. And then, according to the surviving officer's testimony, the ground simply wasn't there anymore. His partner and the cruiser they sat in dissolved into the blackness, as though the earth had opened up. No crash, no debris, no sound. Just absence. The officer staggered back to town, incoherent, his story hushed by his department and dismissed as trauma. But the whispers continued, now fueled by the knowledge that law enforcement had indeed lost one of their own. The years stretched on. A few thrill-seekers disappeared attempting to prove the legends wrong. Others returned, shaken, claiming they had driven straight into nothingness and somehow emerged miles away, hours later, with missing time they could not explain. The stories grew darker, strange lights flickering beyond the tree line, phantom vehicles on the shoulder, and a figure said to be seen standing alone at the edge of the asphalt, only to vanish when approached. And still, the town endured. Because in the daylight, the highway was there again. Commuters took it to work. Truckers used it for freight. Tourists passed through with no idea what lay in wait if they returned after sunset. The pattern remained the same. Every night, without exception, Highway 88 was gone. Every morning, without fail, it reappeared. It was only when construction plans threatened to expand the road, tearing into the soil around mile marker 47, that the mystery escalated beyond whispers. Surveyors reported faulty equipment, sudden sinkholes, and magnetic anomalies that scrambled their tools. Heavy machinery stalled inexplicably when approaching the site. One foreman swore that when he looked across the site at twilight, the half-finished lane his crew had laid down that very morning was no longer there. And yet, under the rising sun, the work was intact. The town demanded answers, but none came. The county downplayed the events. The state avoided comment. And yet, deep in the records, hidden in bureaucratic filings, a curious detail emerged. The land beneath Highway 88 had been purchased decades earlier, not by the government, but by a private holding company. A company with no listed address, no board of directors, and no public records. Just a name that seemed to appear on deeds like a shadow, the Wexler Trust. That was the first real clue. Whoever owned the land had never attempted to sell, never attempted to build, never attempted to develop. They had simply allowed the state to pave a highway across their property without objection, which meant that in the quiet language of legal paperwork, Highway 88 wasn't truly a public road. It was private, leased land. And that raised the question, had the Wexler Trust known all along what lay beneath the ground at mile marker 47? The more people dug, the stranger it became. A century-old newspaper clipping described the same land as cursed soil, where early settlers vanished during a wagon trail expedition. Oral histories from local tribes warned of the shifting path, a place where the earth itself refused to hold memory. And tucked away in the county archives, a yellowing survey map from 1912 depicted no road at all, just a blank space, annotated with a single word in faded ink: unstable. The highway's nightly disappearance was no glitch of modern construction. It was something older, something woven into the bones of the land itself. And if the Wexler Trust had quietly allowed a road to be built there, it suggested a chilling possibility. Someone, somewhere, wanted people to keep traveling over it. Someone wanted the vanishings to continue. The question now was no longer whether Highway 88 disappeared at night. That fact was undeniable. The question was what waited on the other side in the hours when the road was gone. And why, despite decades of loss and fear, did the cycle never break? As autumn drew closer, another disappearance shook the town. This time, it wasn't a stranger, a thrill-seeker, or a drifter passing through. It was a local, someone known and respected. And unlike the others, his disappearance triggered something different, something the town couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a call to uncover the truth. And so began the unraveling of the secret behind the highway that vanished every night. Thamio Elsa's family left to wonder. Life went on, the sun came up, and the highway reappeared every morning like nothing had happened. But then came the disappearance that no one could ignore. His name was Hainatown had grown used to stories of outsiders vanishing on Highway 88. A drifter here, a tourist there, the occasional daredevil who wanted to prove the legends false. It was tragic, yes, but in the way distant tragedies always are. Someone else's son, someone else's brother, Sorry Wallace, a retired teacher who had lived in town all his life. Known for his kindness, his Sunday morning routine at the diner, and his deep roots in the community, Henry was the last person anyone expected to vanish. At 72 years old, he wasn't reckless. He wasn't a thrill-seeker. He wasn't interested in chasing down ghost stories or disproving legends. And yet, one October evening, as twilight fell, Henry Wallace drove out toward mile marker 47, and he never came back. The alarm spread quickly. He wasn't just another missing traveler. He was theirs. His disappearance cut into the fabric of the community in a way the others never had. By morning, his car was gone. No tire marks, no crash site, no signs of struggle. And yet his house keys were still on the hook at home. His wallet had been left behind, and his carefully written grocery list still sat folded on the kitchen counter. The only thing missing was Henry himself, and the sedan he had driven into the twilight. For the first time in decades, the police could not dismiss the case. For the first time, they had to treat the highway as more than folklore. Patrol cars were dispatched, a search party was formed, dogs were brought in to comb the woods along the shoulders of Highway 88. And still, there was nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a broken branch, not even the faintest scent trail for the dogs to follow. It was as though Henry had been erased from the world in the exact moment he crossed into that vanishing stretch of road. The community spiraled into unease. Farmers who had once tolerated the road as a necessary evil now refused to drive it at all. Mothers warned their children to never under any circumstances go near it after dusk. The diner that Henry had frequented became a hub of whispered theories. Some swore the highway wasn't just disappearing, it was consuming. Others claimed Henry hadn't vanished but had been taken, pulled into whatever dimension lay beyond the black space where the asphalt once stretched. It wasn't long before investigators began to dig deeper into Henry's past week, searching for answers. What they found unsettled them even more. Henry had been keeping notes, scribbled journals filled with observations about the highway. His neighbors recalled how, in the weeks before his disappearance, he had spent evenings parked at mile marker 47 just sitting in his car, watching. He had mentioned odd lights flickering in the tree line, unnatural silence that fell in patches across the road, and, most chilling of all, a figure that he had claimed to see nearly every night. A lone silhouette standing at the edge of the asphalt, motionless, as though waiting. He wrote that the figure was always there just before the road vanished. His last entry, dated the day he disappeared, was only a single sentence. "Tonight, I think I'll finally follow it." That detail shattered any notion of coincidence. Henry hadn't been caught unaware. He had gone willingly, in search of something only he thought he understood. And when the highway dissolved into nothingness that evening, he had been part of it. The sheriff's department tried to silence the panic, assuring the public that Henry's notes were the ramblings of an old man chasing local legends. But the townsfolk weren't convinced. They had seen too much. They knew Henry's sharp mind, his clear logic. And above all, they knew he wasn't the type to chase shadows. If Henry had written that he saw something, then he had seen something. Theories multiplied. Some claimed the figure Henry described was the ghost of one of the vanished travelers, doomed to lure others to the same fate. Others believed it was something older, a guardian, or perhaps a predator, bound to the cursed land long before the highway was ever paved. And then there were whispers of the Wexler Trust, the shadowy company that had owned the soil beneath the road for generations. Could it be that Henry had uncovered something about them, something they didn't want known? Soon, investigators began to notice patterns. Henry wasn't the first to describe a figure. Old police reports, yellowing with age, contained similar details. Notes about a man on the shoulder, or a shape in the road that vanished upon approach. Some of the missing travelers had even spoken to family beforehand about seeing someone waiting for them. The connections were undeniable, and yet, every time the pieces came together, the investigation seemed to stall. Paperwork went missing. Files were misplaced. Witness statements were retracted. It was as though something, or someone, didn't want the truth to surface. But Henry's disappearance had awakened something in the community. For the first time, locals began to organize. They were done waiting for the county, the state, or shadowy corporations to step in. Farmers, teachers, retirees, even teenagers who had grown up hearing the warnings. They banded together, determined to uncover the truth about the vanishing highway and the fate of their neighbor. And so plans were made. Not reckless stunts, not foolish dares, but a coordinated effort to watch, to record, and to finally see what happened at the exact moment the road disappeared. Cameras were prepared, drones were charged. Volunteers committed to keeping watch in shifts, ready to capture the phenomenon on film. But what none of them could have prepared for was what would happen the very first night of their vigil. Because as the last light drained from the sky and the trees fell silent, the highway began to shimmer, not vanish outright, but shift, like a mirage rippling in the desert, and for the first time, they saw not only the road disappearing, but something else emerging in its place. Something that was not supposed to be there. The people who had gathered at mile marker 47 that night expected to see darkness swallow the highway whole. just as it had countless times before. They braced themselves for the road to vanish beneath their feet, prepared their cameras to record nothing but empty forest floor where asphalt once stretched. But what they witnessed unsettled them far more deeply than an absence ever could. The disappearance wasn't immediate. It began subtly, with the white lane markings wavering as if painted on water, rippling outward under the glow of their flashlights. The asphalt itself seemed to soften, no longer firm and flat but liquid, unstable, bending under the weight of shadows. And then, with a low vibration that hummed through the soles of their boots, the highway began to dissolve. What emerged in its place was not a void, not blank soil or collapsed earth, but something altogether different. A road that wasn't their own. A darker pavement, narrower, lined not with painted stripes, but jagged cracks that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. It stretched straight through the forest where Highway 88 once ran, yet it did not match the familiar topography. Trees stood at impossible angles, their branches curling inward like grasping fingers. The air thickened, colder, pressing against the lungs. It was a road that did not belong to their world. The townsfolk stood frozen, their equipment humming quietly, lenses trained on the shifting scene. They had prepared to capture the absence of a highway, but not the appearance of another. And yet, their cameras recorded faithfully. The outlines, the warped landscape, even the faint glow that seemed to radiate from beneath the cracked pavement like embers buried just below the surface. For the first time, the vanishing highway wasn't just a disappearance. It was a replacement. Something was trading places. The figure appeared again, exactly where Henry Wallace had described it. A lone silhouette standing at the shoulder, half lit by the wavering light of a volunteer's lantern. It did not move. It did not approach. It simply stood, as if waiting for acknowledgement. One of the younger men, emboldened by adrenaline and the watchful eyes of the group, stepped forward. The others hissed for him to stop, but curiosity pushed him closer. He swore later that the air itself changed as he neared the figure, as though invisible walls pressed against him, forcing his breath short and his vision hazy. And then when he blinked, the figure was gone. Not vanished into the forest, not melted into shadow, but simply no longer there. In its place, the cracked pavement of the strange road pulsed once, as if swallowing the presence whole. The group pulled back, shaken but unwilling to disperse. For hours they watched, documenting every flicker, every ripple of the uncanny highway. The replacement lasted until the first light of dawn touched the horizon. As the birds began their morning chorus, the strange road shimmered and bled away, leaving behind the familiar mundane asphalt of Highway 88, perfectly intact as though nothing had ever changed. When they reviewed their recordings, their triumph quickly curdled into unease. Yes, the footage captured the transformation. Yes, the alien road was visible in every frame. But whenever they tried to slow the video, to study the figure or the glowing cracks, distortions appeared, frames stuttered, images bled into static. And worse, faint shapes appeared at the edges of the recording. Not the figure Henry had described, but dozens of others standing just beyond the tree line, watching. It was then the realization dawned. Henry hadn't simply been taken. He had followed. He had stepped willingly onto that other road, toward whatever lay beyond it. And now, others were waiting. Word spread through town faster than gossip ever had. Some wanted to burn the footage, erase it, and forget. Others demanded more, proof, answers, the end to generations of fear. Theories multiplied. Some whispered the other road was a parallel space, a mirror dimension that overlapped only at night. Others believed it was older, a hidden route meant for something not human, bleeding into their world when conditions were right. But it was the journals of Henry Wallace, now examined more closely, that gave the most chilling clue. Among his notes was a map, crudely drawn but unmistakable. He had traced Highway 88, and then sketched over it the road he claimed to have seen, jagged and wrong, stretching much farther than the county line. In shaky handwriting he had scrawled, "It doesn't end. It leads somewhere." That phrase haunted those who read it. If the road led somewhere, then Henry might not be gone, at least not in the way they thought. Perhaps he was out there still, walking the endless cracked pavement of a place no map could chart. The town divided. Some wanted to investigate further, to step onto the other road themselves, believing Henry's fate might not be sealed. Others warned that any attempt would only feed the cycle, that the highway's hunger thrived on curiosity. Already, they argued, the vigil had drawn too much attention, stirred the wrong kind of interest. And they were right, because as word spread, outsiders began arriving. Paranormal researchers, amateur thrill seekers, even journalists chasing the sensational story of the road that vanishes at night. Cars parked along the shoulders, cameras flashed, drones buzzed overhead. The once quiet town became a stage, and Highway 88 became the star of a dangerous spectacle. The locals watched nervously. They had lived long enough with the road's curse to know it did not forgive intrusion. And sure enough, it wasn't long before another disappearance occurred. This time, on camera, in full view of dozens of horrified witnesses. A man, drawn by arrogance or desperation, had stepped onto the cracked pavement of the other road before anyone could stop him. He smiled at the cameras, waving dramatically as though he were walking into a carnival funhouse instead of another world. But the smile didn't last, because within seconds his body stiffened, his movements jerky, like a puppet with tangled strings. His mouth opened in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror. And then, before the onlookers could blink, he crumpled forward into the asphalt and was simply gone. Absorbed without sound, without trace. The crowd scattered in panic. The footage spread online like wildfire, dissected by believers and skeptics alike. But for the townsfolk, no amount of internet speculation could soften what they knew in their bones. The highway wasn't just disappearing, it was opening. And with every night that passed, the other road seemed to grow stronger, more stable, as though preparing for something larger than a single disappearance. Something was coming. The viral footage of a man vanishing into the strange pavement of the other road spread faster than wildfire. By morning, every major online forum was dissecting it. Was it real? A hoax? Clever editing? Theories flew in from every corner of the internet, each more outlandish than the last. But the townsfolk knew better. They had seen it with their own eyes, and for them the consequences were immediate. The once quiet community, long defined by its farmland, diners, and whispered warnings, became a magnet for outsiders. Cars from out of state lined the shoulders of Highway 88. Reporters prowled the town square, shoving cameras in the faces of reluctant locals. Paranormal investigators lugged strange instruments into the woods, their blinking lights and antennas casting eerie glows after sunset. YouTubers set up live streams, broadcasting to thousands as they camped near mile marker 47, treating the cursed ground like a roadside attraction. The town was suffocating under a spectacle it had never asked for. Locals tried to warn the newcomers, pleading with them not to provoke the highway's curse, but outsiders laughed it off, seeing only an opportunity for fame or fortune. Some set up tents and waited for the nightly transformation. Others drove their cars directly onto the road at dusk, daring fate, certain they would emerge with thrilling footage to upload. The disappearances multiplied. A pair of thrill-seekers live-streamed themselves walking the cracked pavement of the other road, laughing as their flashlights flickered. Their audience watched in real time as the laughter turned to silence, then static, then nothing at all. Their tent and gear were found abandoned the next morning, but the two young men were never seen again. A journalist, desperate for an exclusive, ignored the locals' pleas and drove out alone after midnight. His car was later discovered in a ditch off the old county road, but it wasn't wrecked. It was pristine, the doors locked from the inside, his camera gear still on the passenger seat. Of the journalist himself, there was no trace. Each incident only fueled the frenzy. The highway's legend was no longer local. It was global. And the more people fed it, the stronger the phenomenon seemed to grow. The townsfolk began to notice subtle shifts. The nightly replacement of the highway no longer confined itself strictly to mile marker 47. The cracks appeared farther and farther along the asphalt, stretching in both directions as if the other road were expanding. Locals reported seeing faint glows beyond their fields at night, strange lights that moved across the landscape where no road should have been. Dogs barked relentlessly at shadows. Livestock were found dead at dawn, their bodies twisted, their eyes wide open in terror. The sheriff's department, overwhelmed and unable to stem the tide of outsiders, called for state intervention. But the request was quietly denied. No official agency wanted to acknowledge the phenomenon. Instead, black SUVs began to appear near the site, their drivers expressionless, their presence unexplained. They didn't chase away the outsiders, but they watched them. And whenever someone vanished, these strangers were first on scene, collecting items, recording notes, and leaving without a word. The town was caught between chaos and silence. Outsiders vanished night after night. Locals grew desperate, and the Wexler Trust, the shadowy holding company that had owned the cursed land for decades, finally stirred. Letters appeared in town hall, signed only with the Wexler name, ordering residents not to interfere with the land, not to obstruct access, not to disrupt ongoing research. It was the first time the company had acknowledged its presence in writing, and it raised more questions than it answered. What research? What did they already know? Then came the discovery that shifted the entire mystery. A group of locals, furious at the growing body count, decided to break into the county archives to look deeper into Wexler's history. What they found was chilling. Long before Highway 88 was ever paved, the land had been surveyed for a railway. Construction crews had documented strange collapses, missing workers, and even tunnels that seemed to lead nowhere, dead-ending into solid rock. The railway was abandoned before completion. Wexler purchased the land quietly, under another name, and held it ever since. Even stranger were the maps. Early surveyors had drawn not one road, but two. One was the route that would later become Highway 88. The other was drawn faintly in red ink, labeled only as the Lost Road. Its path mirrored the cracked pavement the townsfolk had now witnessed for themselves. The implication was undeniable. The other road wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a trick of the night. It had always been there, buried, hidden, bleeding into reality only after dark. And then, one evening, a drone flown by an outsider returned with footage unlike anything captured before. Instead of cutting out, instead of showing static, the drone flew farther down the other road than anyone had dared to go. The cracked pavement stretched endlessly, vanishing into a horizon lit by a faint, unnatural glow, and at the very edge of the feed, before the signal dropped, something appeared. It wasn't the figure, it wasn't human at all. It was a structure, massive, looming, lined with sharp, unnatural angles, a building that couldn't belong in their world, half seen through a haze of distortion, rising out of the endless road like a sentinel. The drone's battery died moments later, but the image, however blurred, was enough. The other road didn't just lead somewhere, it led to something. And now, the people of the town understood why Henry Wallace had followed it. They also understood something far worse. The nightly vanishings weren't random. They were a summons. And whatever lay at the end of the lost road was calling more loudly with each passing night. The image of the impossible structure at the end of the other road changed everything. For the townsfolk, it confirmed what they had long suspected. The nightly vanishings weren't random. They weren't accidents or coincidences or even supernatural anomalies without reason. The other road was leading somewhere, and that somewhere wasn't natural. But more than that, the footage drew out the one name that had been whispered like a shadow for decades: the Wexler Trust. Until then, Wexler had been nothing more than a rumor, a faceless entity on property deeds, a name attached to abandoned land and forgotten records. But now, as the road grew stronger and the disappearances escalated, Wexler became visible. The black SUVs that had lingered quietly at the edges of Highway 88 multiplied, forming an unspoken perimeter. Men and women in plain suits walked the tree lines, their eyes cold, their movements efficient. They carried no badges, no insignias, no names. When asked who they were, they offered only silence. But their presence was undeniable, and their interest in the road was unmistakable. And then the town discovered the truth. A retired county clerk, shaken by guilt and fear, admitted that the Wexler Trust had been filing sealed documents for decades. Documents that bypassed local authority, hidden in restricted archives. These files, smuggled into the light by desperate hands, revealed chilling details. Highway 88's construction had not been an accident. It had been directed. Wexler had allowed the state to build a road across their cursed property for one reason: access. They wanted the overlap. They wanted the road to appear, vanish, and return. They wanted a gateway, and worse still, they had been watching it for generations. The files detailed incidents dating back to the 1940s, controlled disappearances where volunteers were observed walking onto the other road, never to return. Reports of structures glimpsed in the distance, notes about the figures on the shoulder, sometimes described as guides, sometimes as guards. Even accounts of strange artifacts retrieved from the cracked pavement, rusted metal fragments, tools of unknown design, bones that did not match any species cataloged in local records. Wexler had been studying the road, feeding it, containing it. The implication was terrifying. For decades, the disappearances had not been random accidents. They had been data. Wexler had been documenting the highway's hunger, tracking the vanishings, and using the town as an experiment site. The people had been unwitting participants in research that stretched beyond their comprehension. And now, the road was changing. It wasn't just mile marker 47 anymore. The replacement spread farther each night, stretching beyond the county line. Drivers who had once felt safe in daylight now reported odd phenomena even at noon. Brief flashes where the road seemed to waver, moments where tires no longer touched asphalt, but something softer, something unstable. The road was bleeding into the world, and the barrier between them was thinning. The townsfolk gathered in secret, furious and afraid. They could no longer trust the sheriff, who seemed unwilling to challenge the suited strangers patrolling the site. They could no longer trust the state, which remained silent despite the growing body count. And they certainly could not trust Wexler, whose hand had guided every disappearance from the shadows. So they turned inward, relying on themselves. Farmers donated fuel for generators. Shopkeepers pooled money for equipment. Families offered basements and barns for secret meetings. A plan began to form, not to expose the highway to the world, because that had already happened, but to understand it on their own terms before Wexler swallowed the truth forever. Henry Wallace's journals became their guide. His crude map of the other road, his notes on the figure, and his final words, "It doesn't end. It leads somewhere," were treated like a blueprint. If Henry had followed willingly, perhaps he had left a trail. Perhaps he had found something the others had missed. The decision was made. They would send their own into the other road. Not reckless thrill seekers, not outsiders chasing clicks, but locals, chosen, prepared, determined to return with answers. The volunteers were few but resolute. A farmer, son, who had lost cattle to the glowing cracks, a young teacher whose students were haunted by nightmares of roads that led nowhere, and an older woman who had lost her brother to the highway decades before. They were given cameras, compasses, ropes, radios. They swore they would not step beyond sight of the watchers at the shoulder. They swore they would return at the first sign of danger. The night they stepped onto the cracked pavement, The town gathered at the tree line, holding their breath. The other road stretched before them, alive with faint pulsing light. The figures were there again, watching silently. The air grew colder, heavier, as the volunteers' flashlights swept across warped trees and a horizon that did not belong. And then, the three of them vanished into the distance. Minutes passed. Then hours. Radios crackled with static. Brief voices drowned in distortion, fragments of words like buildings and shadows and movement ahead. Cameras flickered, recording warped landscapes, glimpses of structures, even once, what looked like a shape crawling across the pavement on all fours, too large, too fast to be human, and then silence. The volunteers never returned. The next morning, the townsfolk found something waiting at the edge of Highway 88. Not the volunteers themselves, but an object, a rusted signpost, its letters indecipherable, coated in a soil that did not match any earth in the county. The message was clear. The road no longer belonged to them alone. It was sending things back. And if the road was growing stronger each night, if it was spreading its reach into the daylight, then soon the entire world might belong to it. The townsfolk realized the truth with a cold certainty. The mystery wasn't about disappearances anymore. It was about survival. And Wexler, silent, patient, watching, seemed to be waiting for that moment. The townsfolk had always believed the road was contained. Even as it vanished nightly, even as people disappeared, they held on to the fragile comfort that dawn would restore everything. But by the time the volunteers failed to return, that illusion had shattered. The other road was no longer a temporary intrusion. It was expanding, anchoring itself, preparing to stay. And Wexler knew it. The black SUVs grew bolder, their patrols more frequent. Temporary floodlights were erected along the shoulders of Highway 88, illuminating the cursed mile as if it were a construction site. Machinery was brought in under the cover of night. Cranes, drills, strange devices that no one in town could identify. Locals who tried to approach were turned back with warnings that felt less like advice and more like threats. It became clear. Wexler wasn't trying to stop the phenomenon. They were cultivating it. The townsfolk pieced together the fragments they had gathered. Wexler had owned the land for over a century, quietly studying the overlap. They had allowed the state to pave Highway 88, not to contain the anomaly, but to feed it, to give it travelers, vehicles, lives to consume. The road wasn't a curse to Wexler, it was a resource. And now, with the other road growing stronger, they were preparing for something final, a full crossing. The signs were everywhere. The nightly transformation spread miles beyond mile marker 47. Entire stretches of forest warped at dusk, trees curling inward, their trunks splitting into unnatural angles. Fields of crops turned to ash overnight, their soil riddled with glowing cracks. Animals fled in panic or were found stiff and lifeless, their bodies contorted as if they had been dragged through invisible gaps. And then came the worst sign of all. The structure glimpsed on the drone footage, the impossible building at the end of the other road, appeared again. But this time, it wasn't faint. This time, as the road replaced Highway 88, the building rose clearly in the distance, massive and undeniable, looming like a black crown against the horizon. Its jagged spires stretched higher than any tower, its surface etched with shifting lines that seemed to move when unobserved. It was closer now. Too close. The town erupted into chaos. Families packed their cars, fleeing before dusk. Others barricaded themselves in their homes, praying that daylight would still bring safety. But for many, the choice was clear. They couldn't run. If the road was expanding, there would soon be no escaping it. And so, a final gathering took place at the town square. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, children, all who remained came together. Their fear etched deep, but their resolve stronger. They knew Wexler would not save them. They knew no state or federal authority would intervene. The world beyond their county still dismissed the road as a hoax. It was on them, and only them, to face the truth. The decision was reckless, desperate, and inevitable. If Wexler sought to cultivate the crossing, then the townsfolk would sabotage it. They would destroy the machines, dismantle the floodlights, and disrupt whatever ritual or procedure the company was preparing. It was their last chance to sever the connection before the other road rooted itself permanently in their world. The night of the confrontation was unlike any before. The air was thick, heavy, humming with an energy that pressed against the chest. The asphalt shimmered and cracked, glowing like veins of molten rock. Figures lined the shoulders in greater numbers than ever before, their silhouettes unmoving, their presence suffocating. And in the distance, the building stood tall, its spires pulsing like a beacon. The townsfolk moved quickly, armed with hammers, torches, and whatever tools they could gather. They smashed Wexler's floodlights, cut wires, and toppled strange devices into ditches. For a moment, it felt like resistance, small but real. But then the road itself responded. The cracks widened, splitting the pavement into jagged fissures. Heat poured upward, searing their skin. The figures at the shoulders stepped forward for the first time, moving in unison, their faces hidden, their presence undeniable. The air grew unbearable, vibrating with a low, guttural sound that was not quite thunder, not quite a voice, but something in between. And then, from the horizon, the building pulsed once, sending a shockwave down the other road. The volunteers who had been lost, the farmer's son, the teacher, the grieving sister, appeared at the edge of the crowd. But they were not themselves. Their eyes were hollow, their movements stiff, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They reached toward the townsfolk as though begging for release, and then collapsed into ash. It was a warning. The road did not return what it took. It remade them. Panic broke the crowd. Some fled into the forest, others fought harder, tearing at machines with bare hands. But the truth became clear in that terrible moment. The road could not be destroyed by human hands. Wexler hadn't been trying to contain it because containment was impossible. They had been preparing to survive it, or worse, to welcome it. And then came the final blow. At the height of the chaos, the structure on the horizon shifted. Its jagged spires twisted and bent, reshaping into an archway, a doorway. Through it, shapes began to move, countless figures taller than men with limbs that bent wrong, with shadows that stretched too far. They were coming. Not just to Highway 88, not just to the town, but beyond. The last survivors fled that night. Some vanished into the forest, never to be seen again. Others escaped down country roads, their headlights cutting through the dark as the sound of the cracking pavement roared behind them. By dawn, the town was silent. Highway 88 was gone. In its place stretched only the other road, endless, glowing, waiting. The county recorded the disappearance of the town as a natural disaster. Maps quietly erased its name. Wexler filed no comment, and the world beyond forgot. But those who drive Highway 88 today, if they can even find it, report strange things. A sudden shift in the pavement, a ripple across the windshield, a stretch of road that seems longer than it should be. And sometimes, if they glance in the rearview mirror at the wrong moment, they swear they see a structure rising on the horizon behind them. The truth is simple and horrifying. The road never ended. It only spread, and wherever it appears, it does not vanish quietly anymore.